In the opulent Roman palaces, there existed a dark reality that history has often chosen to forget. While we celebrate Rome's military conquests, architectural marvels, and legal innovations, we rarely speak of those who paid the highest price to maintain this splendor, young men forced into lives of servitude as male concubines to the wealthy and powerful. These weren't just servants or slaves performing household duties. They were human beings trapped in a system designed to exploit their youth, beauty, and vulnerability for the pleasure of Rome's elite. Their stories reveal a side of the Roman Empire that challenges our romanticized view of this ancient civilization, exposing the brutal reality of what it meant to be powerless in a world where might made right. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing to Historical Mysteries for more content like this. Then please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Share your commitment with the phrase, "I practice inner strength," in the comments, and let's embark on this mysterious historical journey to reconnect with our own truth. Ready? Let's begin. The Roman Empire's relationship with intimate companionship was vastly different from modern understanding, where we might see clear boundaries between consent and coercion. Romans saw a complex hierarchy where power determined everything. At the bottom of this hierarchy were young men, often taken from conquered territories or born into slavery, who found themselves thrust into roles they never chose. These young men, some barely teenagers, were selected not for their skills or intelligence, but for their physical appearance and perceived ability to provide entertainment for their masters. They lived in a constant state of uncertainty, never knowing when they might be summoned, what would be expected of them, or how their refusal or compliance might affect their survival. The selection process itself was dehumanizing. Wealthy Romans would visit slave markets, much like modern people might visit a livestock auction, examining potential purchases for their physical attributes. Age and origin. Young men from Greece were particularly praised for their supposed refinement and education, while those from Germanic tribes were valued for their fair complexion and robust build. The buyers showed no consideration for the terror these young men must have felt, standing exposed and vulnerable while strangers debated their worth. Once purchased, these concubines entered households where their lives were no longer their own. They were expected to be available at all hours, to anticipate their master's needs before being asked, and to maintain an appearance of willing participation regardless of their true feelings. The psychological toll of this existence cannot be overstated. Imagine being forced to smile and appear grateful while enduring treatment that violated every aspect of your dignity and autonomy. The daily routine of a male concubine varied depending on their master's preferences and social status. Some were kept in luxurious quarters, dressed in fine clothes, and given access to education and cultural activities, but always with the understanding that these privileges came at a price. Others lived in conditions barely better than common slaves, called upon only when their master desired their company, then dismissed back to quarters where they had no privacy, no personal possessions, and no hope of escape. What made their situation particularly tragic was the complete lack of legal protection or recourse. While Roman law provided some protections for citizens, and even certain rights for slaves, male concubines occupied a gray area where their master's desires took precedence over any consideration of their well-being. They couldn't seek help from authorities, couldn't form meaningful relationships with others, and couldn't even express their suffering without risking punishment. The psychological manipulation these young men endured was perhaps even more damaging than the physical aspects of their servitude. Masters often employed techniques designed to break down their resistance and create dependency. Some concubines were given special privileges or shown temporary kindness, only to have these gifts withdrawn as punishment for perceived slights. This created a constant state of anxiety and confusion, as they never knew whether they were in favor or facing punishment. Many masters deliberately isolated their concubines from other household members, preventing them from forming friendships or alliances that might provide emotional support. This isolation was particularly cruel for young men who had been torn from their families and communities, as it prevented them from maintaining any connection to their former identities or cultures. The competitive nature of some households added another layer of psychological torture. When masters kept multiple concubines, they often pitted them against each other for attention and privileges. This prevented solidarity among the victims and created an atmosphere of constant tension and betrayal. Young men who might have found comfort in shared experiences instead found themselves competing for their master's favor, knowing that falling out of favor could mean facing even worse treatment. The education provided to some concubines was itself a form of control. While learning to read, write, and engage in philosophical discussions might seem like opportunities, these skills were taught primarily to make the concubines more entertaining companions. They were expected to be able to discuss literature and politics, but only in ways that pleased their masters. Their education was another tool used to shape them into more perfect objects for their owner's enjoyment. Physical appearance was maintained through strict regimens that concubines had no choice but to follow. They were required to exercise regularly, maintain specific diets, and undergo grooming practices that kept them looking youthful and attractive. Some were even given cosmetic treatments or surgeries to alter their appearance according to their master's preferences. These procedures were performed without modern medical knowledge or pain management, making them both dangerous and excruciating. The clothing and jewelry worn by concubines served as both ornaments and symbols of ownership. Masters often took pride in how beautifully they could dress their companions, treating them like living dolls rather than human beings. The irony was that while concubines might be draped in silk and gold, they remained utterly powerless beneath these beautiful trappings. Travel was another aspect of their lives that might seem privileged, but was actually another form of control. Some concubines accompanied their masters on trips to other cities or provinces, but this travel was never voluntary. They were essentially portable property expected to provide the same services regardless of location, while adapting to new environments and social situations without complaint. The social dynamics of Roman households created additional challenges for male concubines. While they might live in luxury, they had no real status within the household hierarchy. Other slaves might look down on them, seeing their role as shameful, while free members of the household treated them as temporary diversions rather than people worthy of respect or consideration. The impact on families left behind cannot be overlooked. When young men were taken as concubines, their families often never learned what had become of them. Parents might spend years wondering whether their sons were alive or dead, never knowing that they were trapped in situations from which escape was nearly impossible. This separation was particularly cruel in cultures where family bonds were sacred and community support was essential for survival. Some concubines were acquired through debt slavery, where families facing financial ruin were forced to give up their sons to pay their debts. These families faced the impossible choice between watching all their children starve or sacrificing one son to save the rest. The psychological burden on both the families and the young men involved was devastating, as everyone involved knew the sacrifice being made. The few records that exist of concubines attempting to escape paint a picture of desperate young men, driven to take enormous risks for even the slimmest chance of freedom. The punishments for failed escape attempts were severe and public, designed to discourage others from making similar attempts. These punishments often involved not just physical pain, but public humiliation, as masters wanted to demonstrate their complete control over their property. Some concubines tried to end their suffering through suicide, but even this final escape was often denied to them. Masters, who had invested significant sums in purchasing and maintaining their concubines, took measures to prevent this loss of property, including constant supervision and removal of any objects that could be used for self-harm. The religious aspects of Roman society provided no comfort to these young men. While Romans worshipped gods associated with protection and justice, these divine protections apparently did not extend to male concubines. Some found solace in foreign religions or mystery cults, But even these spiritual practices had to be conducted in secret, as masters often controlled every aspect of their concubines' lives, including their religious beliefs. The economic value placed on concubines created a market that encouraged the continued capture and sale of young men. Wealthy Romans competed with each other to acquire the most beautiful or talented companions, driving up prices and creating incentives for traders to continue supplying this market. The commodification of human beings reached its peak in these transactions, where young men's lives were reduced to simple monetary calculations. Training schools existed specifically to prepare young men for lives as concubines, much like gladiator schools prepared fighters for the arena. These institutions were as brutal as they were profitable, systematically breaking down the personalities and resistance of their students while teaching them the skills expected by their future masters. The curriculum included not just physical training, but psychological conditioning designed to create compliant, attractive companions. The age at which young men entered this life varied, but many were still children when their fates were sealed. The developmental impact of growing up in such circumstances cannot be overstated. These boys never had the opportunity to form normal relationships, develop their own interests, or even understand what healthy human connections might look like. Regional differences in how concubines were treated reflected the diverse cultures within the Roman Empire, but none of these differences offered true protection or dignity. In some provinces, local customs provided slightly better conditions, while in others, the treatment was even harsher. However, regardless of location, the fundamental lack of freedom and autonomy remained constant. The retirement or aging of concubines presented another cruel aspect of their existence. Unlike other slaves who might eventually earn or buy their freedom, concubines who lost their physical appeal often found themselves discarded, with no resources or skills for independent survival. Some masters simply abandoned their aging companions, while others sold them to lower-status households, where conditions were often worse. The rare cases of concubines who managed to gain their freedom and achieve some measure of success in later life stand out precisely because they were so exceptional. These individuals often had to completely reinvent themselves, hiding their past while struggling to overcome the psychological damage of their earlier experiences. Their success stories, while inspiring, also highlight how unusual it was for anyone to escape this system intact. Medical care for concubines was provided not out of compassion, but to maintain their value as property. Masters wanted to keep their investments healthy and attractive, so they provided medical attention when necessary. However, this care was limited to maintaining appearance and function, with no consideration for psychological well-being or long-term health consequences. The social acceptance of this system among Roman elites reveals much about the moral framework of ancient Rome. While Romans prided themselves on concepts of honor, duty, and virtue, these ideals apparently only applied to free citizens of appropriate social status. The suffering of concubines was simply considered irrelevant to moral calculations, demonstrating how completely they had been dehumanized in Roman society. Some concubines developed what we might now recognize as survival strategies, learning to read their master's moods, anticipate their desires, and navigate the complex social dynamics of their households. While these skills helped them avoid the worst punishments, they also required them to become expert actors, constantly performing contentment and gratitude while suppressing their true feelings. The seasonal patterns of Roman social life affected concubines' experiences as well. During major festivals and celebrations, they might be expected to participate in elaborate entertainments, while quieter periods might offer brief respite from constant attention. However, even these quieter times were marked by anxiety about when they might next be summoned. Communication with other concubines or slave was often restricted, but when possible, these young men developed their own networks of support and information sharing. They learned to communicate through subtle gestures and coded language, sharing warnings about masters' moods or offering comfort during particularly difficult times. These connections, while necessarily secretive, provided crucial emotional support in an otherwise isolating existence. The impact of this system extended beyond its immediate victims to influence Roman society as a whole. The normalization of treating human beings as objects for pleasure contributed to a broader culture of exploitation and dehumanization. This cultural acceptance made it easier for Romans to justify other forms of cruelty and oppression, from gladiatorial games to the brutal suppression of slave revolts. Archaeological evidence provides glimpses into the lives of these forgotten victims. Artifacts found in wealthy Roman households include objects that were likely used to control or monitor concubines, as well as personal items that hint at their daily experiences. However, most physical evidence of their existence has been lost to time, just as their voices were silenced in life. The literary references to male concubines in Roman writings are often brief and euphemistic, reflecting the author's desire to acknowledge these relationships without describing their more disturbing aspects. Between the lines of these texts, however, we can read the reality of lives characterized by powerlessness and exploitation. The transition periods when concubines were sold from one master to another were particularly traumatic, as they faced the uncertainty of new households, different expectations, and unknown levels of cruelty or kindness. Each transition meant starting over in terms of learning how to survive in a new environment, while maintaining the psychological defenses that had kept them alive in their previous situation. Some masters treated their concubines as temporary diversions, quickly losing interest in either selling them or relegating them to ordinary household slavery. Others developed long-term attachments that, while still fundamentally exploitative, provided a degree of stability and predictability. Neither situation offered true security, as the concubine's fate always remained entirely dependent on their master's whims. The seasonal migration of wealthy Romans between their urban houses and country villas meant that many concubines spent their lives moving between different environments and social contexts. This constant adaptation required tremendous psychological flexibility while preventing them from ever establishing roots or forming lasting connections with places or people. The education of concubines in music, poetry, and conversation created a cruel irony. They were taught to appreciate beauty and culture while being denied any opportunity to create or contribute to these fields themselves. They became living repositories of artistic knowledge and skill, but always in service to others' enjoyment rather than their own expression. Physical training regimens imposed on concubines were designed to maintain their appeal to their masters. But these programs were often extreme and punishing. Young men had no choice but to endure whatever exercise, dietary restrictions, or body modifications their masters demanded, regardless of the physical or psychological cost. The seasonal celebrations and festivals of Roman society created additional pressures for concubines, who were often expected to participate in elaborate entertainments or private celebrations. These events might seem festive from the outside, but for the concubines involved, they represented additional opportunities for humiliation and exploitation. The development of personal relationships between concubines and other household members was complicated by the ambiguous nature of their status. While they might live in relative luxury, everyone understood that their position was based entirely on their master's favor, making genuine friendship or romance nearly impossible. The regional trade networks that supplied young men to serve as concubines stretched across the entire Mediterranean world and beyond. This system created incentives for warfare, kidnapping, and debt slavery as traders sought to meet the demand from wealthy Roman households. The human cost of maintaining this supply chain was enormous, affecting not just the victims but entire communities and cultures. The training and conditioning of concubines involved not just learning specific skills, but undergoing psychological manipulation designed to break down their resistance and create dependency. Masters and their agents became expert at identifying and exploiting psychological weaknesses, using techniques that would be recognized today as systematic abuse. The clothing and ornamentation of concubines served multiple purposes beyond mere decoration. These items marked their status, demonstrated their master's wealth and taste, and served as constant reminders of their lack of autonomy. Even their physical appearance was not their own to control. The medical and grooming practices imposed on concubines often involved procedures that were painful, dangerous, or permanently disfiguring. These practices were performed without regard for the concubine's consent or comfort, treating their bodies as objects to be modified according to their master's preferences. The psychological impact of growing up or spending formative years in such circumstances created lasting damage that affected every aspect of these young men's lives. They never had the opportunity to develop normal concepts of consent, autonomy, or healthy relationships, making recovery extremely difficult even if they eventually gained freedom. The social isolation imposed on many concubines prevented them from developing the social skills and connections that might have helped them survive or escape their situations. This isolation was often deliberate, as masters wanted to prevent their property from forming alliances or receiving outside support. The economic calculations that determined concubines' fates reduced human beings to simple monetary values, with prices fluctuating based on factors like age, appearance, skills, and origin. This commodification made it easier for masters to justify treating them as disposable objects rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. The impact on Roman society of normalizing this level of exploitation and dehumanization extended far beyond the immediate victims. A culture that could accept the systematic abuse of vulnerable young men was prepared to accept other forms of cruelty and injustice, contributing to the broader pattern of oppression that characterized much of Roman history. The few glimpses we have of resistance and rebellion among concubines reveal the desperate measures some took to assert their humanity and dignity. These acts of defiance, while often futile and severely punished, demonstrate that the human spirit could not be completely crushed, even under the most oppressive circumstances. The religious and philosophical systems of Rome provided no meaningful protection or comfort for these victims. While Romans debated complex questions of ethics and virtue, they apparently saw no contradiction between these lofty ideals and the systematic exploitation of powerless young men. The seasonal rhythms of Roman social life created predictable patterns of exploitation, with certain times of year bringing increased demands on concubines' time and energy. These patterns meant that even during relatively quiet periods, they lived with the knowledge that busier and more demanding times were approaching. The impact of this system on the families and communities from which concubines were taken cannot be overlooked. The loss of young men to this trade affected not just the immediate victims, but entire social networks, contributing to the broader disruption and suffering caused by Roman expansion and exploitation. The training and preparation of concubines involved systematic techniques for breaking down their psychological defenses and creating compliance. These methods were refined over generations of practice, creating a system that was both efficient and devastating in its impact on its victims. The legal framework of Roman society provided no meaningful protection for concubines, treating them as property rather than persons with rights. This legal invisibility made their suffering invisible as well, allowing masters to act with complete impunity while society looked the other way. The economic incentives that drove this system created a self-perpetuating cycle of exploitation, as the profits from trading in human beings encouraged the continued capture and abuse of young men. Breaking this cycle would have required fundamental changes to Roman society and values that never occurred. The physical and psychological conditioning imposed on concubines was designed to create perfect compliance, but the human cost of this conditioning was enormous. Young men were systematically stripped of their autonomy, dignity, and sense of self, often never recovering these essential aspects of humanity, even if they later gained freedom. As we reflect on these forgotten stories of suffering and survival, we must remember that behind every historical statistic was a real human being with hopes, fears, and dreams that were never allowed to flourish. The concubines of ancient Rome were not footnotes to history, but individuals whose experiences reveal important truths about power, exploitation, and human resilience. Their stories challenge us to look beyond the marble facades and golden treasures of ancient Rome to see the human cost of this civilization's grandeur. They remind us that historical progress often came at the expense of the most vulnerable members of society, and that the price of luxury and power was frequently paid by those who had no choice in the matter. The systematic nature of this exploitation demonstrates how easily societies can normalize and institutionalize cruelty when it serves the interests of the powerful. The Romans' ability to maintain elaborate philosophical and legal systems while simultaneously operating this network of human trafficking shows how selective moral reasoning can become when it challenges existing power structures. These young men's experiences also illuminate the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Despite facing circumstances designed to break them completely, many found ways to maintain some sense of self and dignity. Their small acts of resistance, moments of connection with others, and determination to survive represent triumphs of humanity over systematic dehumanization. Understanding their stories helps us recognize similar patterns of exploitation and abuse in our own time. While the specific forms may have changed, the underlying dynamics of power, vulnerability, and systematic oppression remain relevant today. Their experiences serve as a warning about what can happen when societies allow the powerful to treat other human beings as objects for their pleasure and profit. The silence that has surrounded these stories for so long reflects our continued discomfort with acknowledging the full extent of historical injustice. By bringing these forgotten voices back into historical consciousness, we honor their memory and remind ourselves of our obligation to prevent such systematic abuse from occurring again. The concubines of ancient Rome lived and died in circumstances that no human being should ever have to endure. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as titillating historical curiosities, but as testimonies to human suffering and resilience. In remembering them, we acknowledge their humanity and commit ourselves to building a world where such exploitation becomes impossible. Their legacy challenges us to examine our own society's treatment of its most vulnerable members and to ask ourselves what future historians might discover about the systematic injustices we choose to ignore or accept today. The questions their stories raise about power, consent, and human dignity remain as relevant now as they were 2,000 years ago. In the end, the horrific life of a male concubine in the Roman Empire serves as a stark reminder that civilization's greatest achievements often rest on foundations of unspeakable cruelty. By understanding and acknowledging this truth, we honor those who suffered and commit ourselves to ensuring that such systematic dehumanization never again becomes the hidden price of progress and prosperity. Don't let these crucial historical insights fade into obscurity. If this deep dive into the hidden corners of the Roman Empire resonated with you, please consider sharing this video with others who appreciate uncovering the raw, untold stories of our past. Your support helps historical mysteries bring more forgotten narratives to light, ensuring that these voices are never truly silenced. Join our community and let's continue to explore history's most profound secrets together.